Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. All right, we're here with Carleton University's Philippe Lagassé. The federal government released their updated defense plan policy this week, and Philippe co-wrote a op-ed in the Globe and Mail about it. I'm going to link to that in the description below. But the question I mostly have is that everyone's focusing on the NATO 2% thing, which I know is a kind of a stupid metric because if you crash your economy, you can get to your 2% really easily. But instead, I want to focus on what this does for our capabilities, because that tends to be the more pressing question when it comes to what can we contribute to NATO. So Phil, what are you seeing in this?
So I think it's important to read this defense policy update in the context of the previous one in 2017,
Okay.
and in the context of NORAD modernization. And once you kind of put those three pieces together, then you start seeing what the overall plan to recapitalize the Canadian Armed Forces is. And so a lot of people will kind of focus on this one and say, well, it's fairly limited. I mean, there's only this amount of money or whatever it is. This is part of an overall plan. As others have noted, it would have been helpful in a way for the document to also include kind of here's how this fits into the context of everything else that we're doing and have done. But really, so bearing that in mind, I think it's important to see this as a policy that is attempting to deal with some short-term issues right away,
Hmm.
particularly around kind of sustainment of fleets before new fleets come, as
Yes.
well as announcing some new capability measures that are going to come further down the line. But so much of the criticism has been, well, all this is kind of backfilled or it's coming much, much later. That's not always true. Some of it is coming sooner, but it's also important to realize that this is part of a wider envelope of things. And just to kind of put a finer point on it, I'll get more critical after, but the PDO kind of pegs the overall recapitalization spend for the military at over 200 billion
Hmm.
over the next 20 years. This is adding another 70 to that. So it's not nothing.
Yeah.
And we can talk about whether or not, the fact that it's a lot of the spending is later matters. But, this is basically addressing things that weren't addressed in the previous announcements. There's still some things that it has left open. We can talk about that as well, but
Yeah.
what terms exploring options, but it is plugging certain holes that needed to be plugged.
Okay. I guess with that in mind, part of I mean I'm kind of two minds of the whole 20-year timeline thing because on the one hand I know that there is a long lead time for a lot of these in terms of life cycles. So it helps to have some forward planning going ahead. On the other hand, it does kind of make it look like a bit of a cop out. And I'm wondering if where you see that balance lying in what they've proposed.
So where I'm going to be very sympathetic towards the government and the department and the forces is pointing to the fact that when we say, oh, well, all this money is backfilled, it may never happen. I feel like that conversation is still stuck in 2015. Look at what has happened since 2017,
Yeah.
and you've seen a substantial number of things moving through the pipeline, slower than they should. Like, okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
just look at, even last year, the number of contracts that were signed. So even though a lot of this was backfilled, the department and the forces have been working kind of on overdrive, moving program. They've been moving a lot of program. And part of the problem is, and we've discussed this in the past, Dale, is right now they're moving so much program on the civilian side that a bunch of new capability projects would probably have difficulty making their way through the system. And the
Right.
policy even admits this because it's promising to spend, I think, 1.8 billion to hire a bunch of new civilians, right, to help process like the everything that it's doing here. Now, whether or
Yeah.
not that's going to survive a future government, who knows?
Yeah.
But it's important to bear in mind that in certain some of this backloaded funding or some of these additional projects, it's to be expected. And the record over the past, 5, 6, 7 years is still positive in terms of, yes, promising things that come later, but the contracts are being signed.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't know that that gets enough attention or I don't know if it, I don't know if I want to say credit, but I don't know. Yeah, that just that there's enough recognition that these things took time to get to that point, and um, they are happening. But it's yeah on a timeline that a lot of people don't like to consider because everything is so short term in the political thinking.
And the thing is, this is not to excuse or to say that everything's great.
Mhm.
Um, I have wrote another piece for War on the Rocks this week with Justin Massey, and we kind of looked at the actual readiness of the forces as has become known
Yeah,
is deplorable, right? Like the fleets are old, there's not enough technicians, there's a lot of problems,
yeah,
and there's a severe lack of personnel. So, in saying that the capital program has been making progress, that is not to say that the Canadian Armed Forces are swell. They are
yeah,
not.
yeah.
The minister has said explicitly they are in a personnel death spiral. So that is a very serious issue.
Mhm.
Um, I guess my only kind of point on this is it's the personnel piece and the readiness piece that are kind of the hottest fires right now. The
Yeah.
capital piece, the recapitalization, the equipment is making progress. This is contributing to that progress. What it doesn't do as effectively is there's a number of areas where maybe it maybe could have been much bolder, let's say, on some of the personnel stuff. It could have been much bolder on some of the other areas where more progress could have been made in the short term. And maybe we can get into that.
Yeah, I guess when we were talking about the personnel death spiral, that was one of the things I noticed is they did talk about some reforms they're hoping to make in terms of recruitment and ways in which they do the recruiting. And I'm wondering if this is something that you can remark on, or if that's not quite your area of expertise here.
Well, I'll just mention briefly. I mean, they have some measures in there that are hopeful,
Mhm.
right? So, particularly around quality of life, housing, childcare, career planning, things of that nature. I would have advocated for, an immediate major injection of salaries and fund and that kind of thing to keep people in uniform, really
Mhm.
vastly increase the incentives. Other things that you could have done on that front. But recognizing that that is a problem that the forces has really struggled with. And just as importantly, though, pretty much every military right now is struggling with. And this is the other piece of this. The
Mhm.
reason it's more acute in Canada is because we were already short. And when you add in the equipment, the older equipment woes that we have, it makes for a really kind of sorry state of affairs currently.
Right.
Uh, and that's more the reality.
Yeah, and I don't know that and I actually just in the last couple of weeks was seeing pieces in the media about the crisis the Americans are finding themselves in, which is almost unusual to hear of because they've always had such a robust I guess recruitment system, and for that to be breaking down, I which I have to wonder is how much of that is an aftermath of just kind of what happened with the pandemic, and how much of that is just the fact that economies are doing much better in the world, and when people have higher paying jobs elsewhere, the military always looks like a less desirable option. And I also have this pet theory about Canada where once Fort McMurray became a destination that there were weekly flights to, that made that a much more attractive option than the military for certain parts of the country.
Right. So you're correct. I think a lot of this is dealing with post-pandemic. A lot of this is dealing with just a general attitude towards work and sacrifice and what we're willing to do. I think
Mhm.
that's a piece of this. Being wearing a uniform is not something that you just zoom into every day.
Yeah.
I mean, even if you are able to work from home on occasion, I mean, for a lot of people that, that are deployed or have jobs that require them to be there full time. Um, when you have these prospects of much easier jobs elsewhere and your skill sets are valued, and there's
Mhm.
just look at the airline industry, same thing. Like taking up pilots and all this stuff. It's an extremely difficult environment for the armed forces to recruit and retain in. But again, could this is why something like a significant salary increase might have
Mhm.
made sense or something like that. And they are studying it, but if you want your armed forces to be more competitive in this very tight labor market, or what was a tight labor market, we don't know where
Yeah.
it's headed.
I mean, it's still pretty tight.
Yeah, I mean, you're going to need to be more creative, but I can understand the caution as well on the part of the government here heading into an election.
Yeah, no, for sure. So I guess with those two pieces in mind, you also had some other short-term considerations about what this is, isn't really addressing.
So one big thing, there's a long list of areas where they're still going to explore
Mhm.
options.
Yeah.
And I think the two big ones are, okay, the three big ones. First, submarines,
Yes.
which we know we need to make a decision on. And the fact that we're now punting this decision potentially for 4 years means that we need the Navy, despite, whether they like it or not, if they want to maintain that capability, they need to start thinking about how do you get Canadian submariners on Allied boats. You have to start thinking of ways of maintaining that personnel side of it so
Yeah.
that you're actually ready to get back into that game if a decision is ever made here. The fact that it's being delayed is probably not great, to say the least. And it's really too bad in a way. But that being said, it's extremely expensive. And I also, I take the prime minister at his word here that they want to explore all options, and the cabinet, whether this one or future one, will discover that nuclear is probably way too expensive, way too complex. But at the very least, it's good to ask the question in the
Mhm.
context of AUKUS, and it's good to ask the question in the context of Arctic sovereignty and security.
Yeah.
So, it would have been good to have the green light on that, but there we are.
Yeah, I
Tanks.
did notice that they on CBC yesterday they asked the French Prime Minister about the possibility of Canada buying subs from France, and I just that I guess might be an option that because I know there was such a reaction with France with AUKUS that I wonder if we're going to play any kind of role in balancing that.
Oh, it's quite possible. I mean, I think the countries that want to sell the subs, you got the South Koreans, the Japanese, the Swedes, the Germans, and the French, as you mentioned. So there's a lot of options. I'll just note on the nuclear front, Brazil is buying nuclear submarines from France. So
Oh,
this is why I kind of balk a bit when people say, "Oh, we could never do that. It would just be way
yeah,
beyond our capability." And you're going, "Well, okay, well, really?" I mean, uh, okay,
yeah,
sure.
yeah.
There's an ambition issue there as well, I think.
All right, and you had two other points,
So the other one is tanks, main battle tanks.
right?
So that one is also being explored. I don't know where that one's going to head. Far less expensive than submarines, but politically probably a more controversial one. There's going to be a lot of questions about does it make sense to maintain that capability within a Canadian Armed Forces? Do we have the size? Do we have an army that's really made for that today, or should we focus in on other things? So even though it's a less expensive piece of equipment,
Mhm.
I suspect that it'll still be controversial.
Oh, I
Um,
do remember there being some controversy when we acquired all this Leopard 2s for Afghanistan and whether that was the right choice or not at that time.
exactly. So this will come up, I think, and everything that surrounded the sending of the tanks to Ukraine kind of revived that a little bit as well. But
Mhm.
it's a here again, it's a conversation worth having, right? Is
Yeah.
this a capability that Canada should maintain or not, and what's involved in that? And some of the other ones, like counter drone, were another kind of interesting one where exploring that seems late to need, as they say. You kind of need to start getting into that game sooner rather than later, particularly given our forward deployment in Latvia.
Yeah, and that seems to be where the game is headed in terms of modern warfare.
Yeah, no, exactly. So, and to that point, what I would have also wanted to see a little bit more of was digitization. I think one of the highlights of this policy is about $10 billion for defense infrastructure. that doesn't
Mhm.
get a lot of coverage, but that the infrastructure piece across the country has been in dire need of some real injection of money. So
Yeah.
this is really good news on that front. But the reason that the infrastructure side of things got so dilapidated over the years is nobody ever really fully owned it, right? It used to
Mhm.
like it would belong to the Air Force for the Air Force stuff, but because it wasn't like frontline capability, it didn't get the attention it needed. Then it
Yeah.
got sent to somebody else, but a centralized kind of infrastructure piece, but they weren't in a good position to advocate for the money because they weren't like at the front line.
Yeah.
And there's a risk that we end up doing the same thing when it comes to networks, bandwidth, digital,
Yeah.
where it has to be something that's kind of tied to every project, every capability, because otherwise, you get an F-35, you get a P-8, like it's got all this data. Like if
Yeah.
you're going to use the thing, you need to be able to process that.
Yeah.
And I just worry that that's going to kind of fall through the cracks.
Yeah. The other thing I noticed was the cyber aspect. And I know that cyber is one of the places where Canada actually does play a fairly leadership role. And this does seem to capitalize on that a little more as well.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. A joint CSC, Canadian Armed Forces Cyber Command, that kind of recognizes that they both have authorities and roles here. So that'll be interesting to see how that kind of works. Luckily, they're under the same minister, so there's less of kind of an issue around that.
Mm.
But there's going to be questions around the legal frameworks of under what legal framework they're operating, and this gets back to some of the conversations that we've had around crime prerogative,
Yeah.
because the forces will operate under crime prerogative for a lot of this stuff, whereas CSC has its own legal frameworks.
Right.
So this will be interesting.
All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to walk us through this, and we'll do this again in the future.
Sounds great.
All right. Thanks. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. It's at Journo_Dale on Twitter and JournoDale no underscore on Bluesky. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.